There's no way of knowing whether they'll be good performers or bad performers. There's no way to forecast that into the future.
Any opinion on whether or not it would impact getting to 7?
In the event it was either good or bad, it's such a small allocation, it wouldn't even be a rounding error.
Stephen?
Agreed. Based on the information provided by staff, the amount of the investments would be, to Alan's point, not even a rounding error.
And then secondly, I guess it's linked to that, would be the ability for the trust fund to pay a benefit to any member into the future based upon this decision. Or go, yep.
It just follows the previous question, and the answer is there's no reason to believe there would be any meaningful impact.
Agreed. It's a small impact either way, and you can't predict which way it would go.
And are we aware of any other institutional investors comparable, similar to CalSTRS as a public pension fund that has made a decision to exclude these companies?
Yeah, Philip, do you know
You-
Yeah,
Yes.
several have. I know you see Regents in California. but
Regents, I believe New York,
Which New York one?
New York Common?
I think it's the city. I would like to point, in our engagements, both companies appreciated that we actually came out and met with them and engaged, because they've heard of a lot of these engagements or investments happening without ever even talking to them, just making that decision. So it's clearly a topic the companies are aware of, and it happens.
Yeah, I appreciate that, Philip,
I'll
because
add, just to give them the background, they're aware that there's a divestment effort out there. But I really want to make it, and I know many people in the audience are passionate about and lead that effort. These companies didn't understand why, because no one had met with them face to face. And CalSTRS had the reputation and was there face to face, and to explain to them, which I did personally, if this board chooses to divest, why that was happening and what that would mean to them. I know we've been criticized in the past of what good does engagement do. But if you take an action against somebody and they barely know it and they don't even know your face, they completely disregard it. But when you meet with them face to face and then you make a decision, it has a powerful impact on them. And I just want to say for this fund, I was proud. It was difficult to do this, but I was proud that we were the ones, again, that made the effort to reach out and understand both sides and then make a decision. And I think that's actually very important.
Okay, so what I was going to do, if it's okay with the committee, I was going to hear public comments first, and then we'll go to the committee. So each member of the public will have up to 3 minutes to speak. I think we have 6 members. Emily Goldman, is Ms. Goldman here? And you have there will be a timer up here, Ms. Goldman, so you can see what your time is. Thank you.
And another member has to give their time to me as well, so I do have to hold 6 minutes.
They have to come with the mic to you. Just doesn't get to talk.
And that's a decision I'll make. So you can continue. You can go right to the mic, and we don't have a policy where we do that. But go ahead. Why don't you go speak at the mic at this point? And then who would you like to get your time from? Additional time? And you are, what's your name, ma'am? Nancy Mencia. Okay. Why don't you stand with Ms. Goldman together? And Ms. Goldman, why don't you begin? Thanks.
And I'd really quickly like to clarify that I was told, A, that the board would make a decision, or at least have the conversation about whether or not it was going to be put up for a vote before the public comment period, and that I was also told categorically that someone could cede their time to me.
Okay. Sorry for the miscommunication.
Pardon?
Sorry for the miscommunication. If you could begin,
Yeah.
She can have the time. Just begin your
Okay,
comments.
perfect.
Thanks.
So I'd like to start out by presenting the board with a petition signed by nearly 300 CalSTRS members, in addition to the 2 petitions that were presented at previous board meetings, calling for immediate and complete divestment from Core Civic and Geo Group. I also have a letter of support that I want to give to the board as well, signed by Freedom for Immigrants, California Immigrant Policy Center, Advancing Justice Asian Law Caucus, African Black Coalition, Kehila Community Synagogue, International Socialist Organization, and the Poor People's Campaign. And those are just California-based organizations, not any outside the state. So the statement I prepared today, so my name is Emily Claire Goldman. I'm an international human rights lawyer and the founder and director of Educators for Migrant Justice, which many of you have unfortunately probably heard of at this point. I'm speaking today on behalf of CalSTRS members who not only signed this petition, but co-authored the petition with me, who are outraged that the retirement savings are providing financial support to companies that are aiding and abetting crimes against humanity. CalSTRS has been engaging with these companies for over a year with no evidence of result whatsoever, and no amount of corporate engagement can force a company to change its business model. And since CalSTRS has started this engagement process, the Office of the Inspector General, the oversight body for these companies, has filed 2 scathing reports on CoreCivic facilities as well as GEO Group facilities, including one located right here in California. And since the engagement started, 4 lawsuits have been filed against CoreCivic and 4 against GEO Group, one of which was filed by the State Attorney General for Washington. The allegations against CoreCivic and GEO span more than a decade, and the claims in nearly every single case are identical. The reason CoreCivic and GEO Group are consistently cited for the same abuses is because changing their practices would require them to change their business model. Understaffing, medical neglect, forced labor, these are all deliberate strategies that CoreCivic and GEO Group facilities use to cut corners for profitability. In 3+ months' time that CalSTRS has been engaging with these companies for the investigation, the corporate governance team managed to visit a total of 3 facilities. This is all the more shameful given the fact that staff, at least according to the report that was released on Thursday, failed to visit 2 of the most notorious CoreCivic and GEO Group facilities.
Thank you, Ms. Coleman. Ms. Mencia, so you're next. Would you like to yield your time to Ms. Coleman?
I would like to.
Yeah, so please continue. Thank you.
Thank you. So the staff failed to visit 2 of the most notorious CoreCivic and GEO Group facilities located right here in California. That would be GEO Group's Adelanto facility, which was the subject of a scathing report from the Office of the Inspector General, released just in September, also the subject of an ongoing lawsuit filed December 2017. Then again, there's the California-based CoreCivic Otay Mesa facility, which was not only the subject of an ongoing class action lawsuit in the District of California, but located just 30 minutes away from CalSTRS' off-site board meeting last month. The report makes clear that CalSTRS is more than content taking CoreCivic and GEO Group at their word. Staff relied on company statements and disclosures to reach the conclusion that private prisons have not been involved in the physical separation of families or the temporary detaining of children. And you're right, CoreCivic and GEO Group facilities are now detaining children indefinitely, not temporarily. Lawyers working on the ground have confirmed that children need only be detained in the same facility to qualify as reunited. And that includes children from 150 families who are reunited but still remain in CoreCivic and GEO Group facilities. There's ample evidence that these human rights abuses are systemic, and CalSTRS' insistence on continued engagement in spite of this is frankly embarrassing. On the issue of, in speculating that CoreCivic and GEO Group family detention facilities in Texas would not violate CalSTRS' respect for human rights, the report explains that in both facilities, detainees are open to roam the grounds, the living units were not locked, and there was no razor wire or weapons carried by staff. It's hard to imagine how the bar could be set any lower. This is also a disturbing misrepresentation of the legal standards under international human rights law, which are supposed to be guiding the ESG policies. According to the report, staff understands that work in most facilities is voluntary, yet this implies that some work qualifies as forced labor, which directly contradicts CalSTRS' conclusion that these companies have not violated the ESG factor on workers' rights. Moreover, GEO Group itself has not disputed immigrant detainees' forced labor claims brought in an ongoing lawsuit in Colorado. On the issue of human health, the report acknowledged that the two companies have some influence over the quality of healthcare provided to inmates or detainees, but goes on to say that the healthcare provided is far too often more and better than inmates or detainees would have had access to if not detained. Not only has deliberate medical neglect consistently been cited in class action lawsuits, as well as reports from the Office of the Inspector General, but CalSTR's appalling statement closely mirrors an argument historically used to justify slavery. Despite CalSTR's recognition that ESG compliance is better suited to a legal analysis, colleagues at Human Rights Watch and the ACLU, which have the requisite expertise, were not reached out to despite what Edelman insisted at the last board meeting to stakeholders.
Thank you, Ms. Goldman. The papers that you have for the board, would you please give those to Ms. Stanton? She's behind you. And thank you again for being here and sharing your views with us. Tom Blank, is it? Tom Blank, CTA retired? Is Tom here? I am. Okay. Hi, Tom. Come on. You want to get to a mic? Thank you. Thanks. Member of CTA retired, Cal RTA. Welcome, Tom. And Mark, are you joining, Tom? Okay.
STRS. So I asked Mark to assist me for a moment here because people have a difficult time seeing my friend Harvey. And so I just wanted to follow up. First of all, I want to thank the staff for having done this outreach to gather this information. And I want to provide some information that even some of my brothers and sisters in the organized labor movement are not aware of often, and that is prisons, that includes for-profit prisons, are a $40 billion a year profit-making center for the companies that have moved jobs instead of overseas to behind prison walls. And so, picking on Dana Dillon for a moment because I've met her previously,
Go ahead, Tom. I'm good.
and so this is just to acknowledge that I didn't plan this out with her, though. If she wants to hire both Mark and myself to work for her company, and she's willing to overlook the box that I would have to sign because I've been incarcerated in my mock-up here, and she wants to hire Mark because he's just a hard-working, industrious person, and me because I've had 7 years experience making the good or service that she provides in her company, and I got that, of course, in prison. Can she afford to pay either of us a living wage when she's competing with companies that are not only much larger, but also they get their workforce for free? And that's how this industry hurts our local communities. And our local communities, it's important for the tax base that the people who work in Dana's company would be making living wages so that they can afford to pay the taxes that support our schools, that support their students. That's how that hurts everybody. Aside from what happens with the mistreatment, everyone knows from, if you've seen even one prison movie, that prisons have jobs in the kitchen, in the laundry, in the library, and they're dependent upon and in the janitorial, they're dependent upon those jobs to run their prison on a daily basis. And when the prisoners aren't doing those jobs, they can be threatened with not only loss of commissary privileges, which is like a company store, but also with the they can also be threatened with everything up to and including the solitary confinement. So I'm going to go over by 10 seconds here and just say that the final point is, as applies to the refugees and the asylum seekers, anybody who's paid attention during this most recent time of the midterms knows that there's racial animus and lies that are being perpetrated about people crossing our borders. Those are administrative violations, but they are not crimes. And
Thanks, Tom. I have to be fair in my allotment of time, so thank you
Sure.
so much. And Mark, it's good to
Thank
see you. Jane from Fossil Free California.
Hello, how are you?
I'm here to represent Fossil Free California, and I just want to express their thanks and congratulations to the board and to the staff for such a very thorough report on the divestment from private prisons. We were extremely impressed, and also for considering the wishes of the members, CalSTRS members. Also, on a personal note, as a retired teacher and a CalSTRS member, I urge you to divest from the two companies that you're considering divesting from. Is it GeoCivic and CoreCivic and Geo Group? Okay, that's it, and that's all I have to say. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Doug Orr, CFT. And then Denise Bradford. Denise will be next. Our last speaker on the item. Doug?
Hi, Doug Orr from California Federation of Teachers. I also want to echo what other people have been saying about how detailed and the report was. It really was an amazing report. I also want to thank you for your extensive consultation with the various prison watchdog groups. As the report notes, the private prisons potentially create risks in the area of human rights, workers' rights, and civil liberties. And I would also say, sort of echoing what Chris just said, it's too bad that there isn't a risk factor about immorality, because then it would violate that one as well. But the report points out that these risks are shared between STRS and the contracting agencies, i.e. the governments, and not necessarily the firm, but that means the risks are still very real for CalSTRS. Staff also notes that the investments in private prisons are de minimis in terms of the overall portfolio return in either a positive or negative way, but probably not soon given yesterday's election. But if in the future the government ever does move towards moving away from private sector pensions, then the risk to the fund will only be in the negative direction, but it'll still be small because they're so small. And the staff notes that efforts towards engagement have been essentially exhausted. Based on CalSTRS' divestment policy, that's pretty much all the board needs to know about whether you should be able to divest or not. You've engaged, you've figured out what the financial cost is going to be. It's not going to be very large. And so while the CFT in general favors engagement over divestment, primarily because, as somebody was just pointing out, the firms, once you divest, they don't care, and you've walked away. They don't have to listen to you anymore. But in this particular case, the CFT as an organization has decided to ask that STRS divest from CoreCivic and the Geo Group, primarily because of the number of risk factors affected, the damage that continuing to invest in these companies has in the trust of STRS members in the system, the potential for ongoing negative public opinion, and the very limited impact on the portfolio returns. We would suggest that STRS divest from both CoreCivic and the Geo Group. It's even more important to do this given that the Trump administration has stated its intention to expand the indefinite detention of those seeking asylum in the United States.
Denise Bradford.
Bradford, California Teachers Association Chair of Retirement Committee. I would like to thank CalSTRS staff and board for so thoroughly examining all of this and for the transparency, especially with our members, and for engaging with us. We've had staff talk to our members and explain the engagement process. And we know that you have exhausted pretty much every possibility there could possibly be. And we know that whatever decision you make will be the right one. Thank you.
Thank you, Denise. Turn it over to the committee now. Steve Juarez.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Let me start by just thanking the staff. Along the lines of what Harry alluded to, I think you guys have done a tremendous job of at least trying to unearth what is a very complex project and complex decision. And for that, you know, we are indebted to you, because it's oftentimes we get accused of not having done our homework. And the fact that we went as far as we have to try to establish at least the basis to make a decision, I think, is very laudatory, and I want to just commend all the staff who worked on this. We're very lucky to have you to do that. I did have one concern beyond whether or not we divest from the two firms, and that goes to the non-U.S. firms that were identified in the report, and the fact that we're not bringing forward any necessary, well, I know you didn't bring forward a recommendation on this one, but even the sense that we might want to do something about those non-U.S. firms. And so I want to get a better sense of why that is and whether or not we want to at least have a further discussion at some later date on that issue.
The non-US firms.
Philip, let me jump in first, so it's hard to see me back here. First, for the Treasurer's representative, Stephen, I initiated this under the U.S. companies because of the comments I had received from CTA at their annual meeting, specifically about U.S. corporations. As we investigated it, we realized there were non-U.S. companies. Historically, you have used a revenue threshold in your divestments that if a company, and we've had this even back to tobacco, where people had a small subsidiary that was involved, you look at the scale of that within the overall company. So thermal coal, tobacco, in many cases, there's a revenue threshold, and that's where Philip can get into these non-U.S. companies. They're structured very different. In the U.S., they are REITs and only provide this service. Internationally, they're different. Go ahead.
Yes, the companies, they primarily operate in the UK. They are part of larger government service conglomerates. So the revenue from this aspect of their business is very low. But we are planning a trip to Europe in December, and those companies are on the agenda to try to visit them.
And with the idea that you might bring them back to the board for further discussion, further consideration at some point?
We will definitely bring them back to Committee on Responsible Investment, formerly the 21 Risk Factor Committee, to discuss what we can find there and how they operate. They also operate under a different, legal and sort of societal framework within the countries. I think one's in France too. So we will definitely bring it back if it seems warranted, and definitely report to the board through an email or some other way.
Yeah, I think that's why I asked. It's important in your motion for you to help us create a definition of these companies. It's also helpful for the membership. And Philip described our risk factor committee. That's an internal staff committee. So we go through similar to you, we have our own internal committees that then hear the staff presentation and research. We make a decision, to me, about whether to bring something to you and whether it violates a risk factor.
If I could, just one more question, and that deals with the notion that the respect for political rights was not violated because these are folks who aren't citizens and therefore don't necessarily are subject to those rights. I'm just concerned that is that correct, first of all?
Well, we evaluated it along the aspects of immigration, not just immigrants, but on prisoner detainees, and the application of voting rights post or when you've been convicted varies widely by jurisdiction. I think the reason we don't think the companies violated is they don't have any control over that. That is a locality distinction set by the state. So it ranges from states where prisoners can vote to states where you can't vote at all post conviction at all. But the companies don't really violate that because they're not involved in that decision.
Okay, thank you.
Laura?
So I want to just say that first, thank you to the staff for doing such a thorough job. I really did go through it and keeping in mind that, the fiduciary responsibility that I have as a member, I think in looking at the piece of, we've tried the engagement, really the fiscal impact, I think everybody here says is not going to be that large. But I think, I do personally believe that there is a moral value into what we do. And I think there's a quote that you wrote in this particular assessment that you did, and that I think really sort of, and I may get very emotional about this, but that, private corporations whose purpose is making money, in the end, impacts our communities. And so for me, as I was looking at this, where do we have influence and power? So I would like to make a motion that we do, and I don't know why I'm crying, maybe because I haven't slept in 3 days. I'm glad you started, because and I usually keep it together, but it's something that I think it's really important and valuable to our communities. I actually have been working with the asylum folks who are here this last couple of weeks between elections and in the evenings, being there and who they are and how they're treated. I don't think private prisons have a place in this. I do think people need to be secure, and I do believe in our system and ensuring that that happens. But this is a really personal issue for me because I live in the border. I live in San Diego, and I see it every day, particular to my community. So for me, it's a very important, very emotional issue, and it is a moral issue. In addition to it being an issue that I think we have the power to make a difference. I do want to say that I think it's really powerful that the CalSTRS staff did a petition and that you all signed on to this. It means a lot, I think, to us as communities when people sit together and they are able to advocate on our behalves. And so really thank you to the CalSTRS staff. And I think that says a lot about the culture of this organization, that, thank you, that even though, yeah, I see how wonderful they are.
They bring you nuts.
I know. But to me, it really is a reflection of the culture of this organization that, there's the data that's gathered, and there's the, fundamentally the responsibility that we have to our members. And I did hear what our members had to say and the information that they provided and the letters and everything else. And so I would like to make a motion that we divest from these particular prisons. I want to make sure I'm clear about what's the best way for language as a result of Chris's recommendation, because I do want to make sure that as we're moving forward, we're getting information on what that means for the international ones as well. But I think for this particular piece, for me, it's really important that we do weighing everything. I think it would be important for us to divest at this time.
Okay. There's a motion on the floor to divest from these two specific holdings. Is there a second?
Second.
There's a second. It's a proper motion and the second on the, and it's properly second. I think the maker of the motion has spoke to the issue. Do you want to speak any more to the issue? No. Okay. So we will have discussion on the motion on the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I also wanted to thank the staff. This is such an emotional issue, and, we do have our risk principles, and I thought that you did a very good job of trying to take an emotional issue and look at it a little bit more dispassionately and try to tease out where we stand as an institution. And with the chair's indulgence, I would like to hear a little bit from Fiduciary Council as to what we should be considering as far as our fiduciary responsibility.
Harvey?
Mr. Chairman, members of the board, respectfully, I think it would not be appropriate for me to give fiduciary advice in open session on legal issues. If the board wishes to have that discussion, I would encourage that we reopen agenda item 3 and have the conversation in closed session.
Brian?
Just in your divestment policy,
Yes.
it specifically says that you will receive input from fiduciary counsel, and I believe that fiduciary counsel has provided you confidential input via in writing by email on this particular issue. So that would satisfy the standard that's in your divestment policy to receive input from fiduciary counsel as opposed to an opinion. So, and I believe what Mr. Lederman was discussing was you have an item in your closed session to have to confer with fiduciary counsel and your consultants on investment decisions. So what I'm saying is you have enough information under your policy to proceed, but if you wanted to go down that route, you'd have to agendize the item for another meeting.
Thank you. So it's your opinion, Mr. Parto, that we have received
The language of your divestment policy lists where you should receive input before you make a decision.
And it's your view that we've received that input
And
per
that's-
policy?
right.
We've
The
met the
policy.
policy requirement.
And the policy requirement is input from fiduciary counsel as opposed to an opinion. And so you've already received that. So let's throw that out there.
Sure, Dana, why don't you? How am I going to do this?
Click my name and click the, and then the open bar, the white bar, I think it should move.
Who's going to do that?
Next, and then go previous, and then go back.
Yeah, okay, so Dana has a question on this.
So Brian,
For clarity.
explain to me again why you believe that this would have to be a separate agenda item in a future meeting instead of doing it during the time that we have it now?
Well, the agenda item that you had was a general item, and it wasn't specifically disclosed as a discussion on divestment.
On number 3,
On
if we
number three,
if we
it was
went
a-
into closed
right.
session under number 3.
Under
Can we
number
go into
3.
closed session just to have a discussion with our fiduciary counsel on this item as it's agendized?
No. No, it's not properly agendized to go into closed session on this item.
Okay, thank you.
So let me go back to, Sharon, you're going to have to wait long back in. Lynn, you're still in the queue if you'd like, Lynn.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chair. So, I think this has been a really hard discussion, and the controller obviously feels that there is a moral issue at stake too. But if we are to hold ourselves to our risk factors and our policies, and staff has gone through and done their due diligence and put together a very good document to follow, that at this point, on behalf of the controller, that we do not support divesting from these companies. And partially that was based on the confidential memo that the fiduciary council did send to the full board.
Dana?
Okay. It is an emotional issue. And I think it's going to be another 20 years before we find and see the repercussions of the administration's decision to separate these children from their families. But no matter what we do, well, I shouldn't say that. If we divest, those conditions are still going to exist. The policies will still be the same. The negative public opinion is going to continue. The abuses will continue. And I'm torn. Because I don't think we should be invested in these companies. But unless we're invested in these companies, we have absolutely no say on what they do. And if we want to affect change, if we want to even have an opportunity to affect change, then we shouldn't divest. And people that I've talked to, I've tried to explain that to. My position's on. Because what is it? I mean, there's a lot of issues around private prisons. There's the fact that detainees are being detained in a private prison or in detention camps. There's the whole issue of privatization of public jobs. There's how people are being treated. We don't weigh in on any of those. Philip, I would imagine if we decided to divest today, you guys wouldn't be going to Adelanto or San Diego because we no longer have ownership in CoreCivic or Geo Group. So there's no reason for us to go.
We did go to Adelanto and Ortiz Mesa.
Oh, you already have, already?
We could not do it before agenda item was due.
Okay.
So we did it within the last couple of weeks, but the agenda item already had to be published, so.
And the results?
We didn't see anything vastly different than the other facilities. There were no children detained there. There,
I can jump in, Philip. That was the one where I mentioned that I met somebody who was a member of our
Got
system.
it.
That's because they
That was
lived in
in a-
California, they lived in a high desert
All right.
community, which they employ about 600 people.
So,
And we looked into the abuses that were in
Okay.
the
Thank
IGA
you.
report.
I appreciate that, Chris. Guys, I don't know where to go. But I think it has to be said that I think our members of our system, and this is hard for me to say, are gonna have an opportunity to say, I've washed my hands of that because my pension system is no longer invested. And I'm not sure that's where we should be. Harvey, under our fiduciary duty, I'm trying to remember the conversations we've had in the past about ESG. We've talked about if you divest, then you should replace it with something of equal or greater value, correct? And I can't I'm trying to, there's a name for that, but I can't find it. So Chris and Philip, let me ask you this. If we divest, have you researched other investments that would be more profitable for us?
As Philip's memo tries to lay out, when we talk to the Global Equity Group, these companies are not in our active managers portfolio, so they've already looked at other companies and invested elsewhere. These are only in our passive US index portfolio. We would pull them out and just redistribute that $10 million over the remaining 2,950 stocks. Which, as Alan and Stephen said, should be better, but you don't know because you can't predict the future. In the fixed income portfolio, they would redistribute it to other opportunities within fixed income. And again, it's very de minimis, so for them, that wouldn't impact what their opportunity set.
Alrighty, thank you very much. I don't think I can add anything else.
So we're going to take a short break, and we'll be back in about 5 or 7 minutes. We're going to get started in a minute, please. Quiet down.
Quiet. You did say it had to simmer down.
What happened to my, what happened to my? How does this manage? Okay. That's okay.
Thanks, Gur's here.
All right. So, thank you, Gur. Getting us straightened out here. While Gur gets this to, wow, it's a restart. Okay, so we're back. We have 3 people in the queue. I have a question for Chris. Chris, if the committee were to vote to divest from these 2 companies, in your view, is there enough in our policy that would support that decision?
Absolutely. As I said at the end of my statements, we think you have all the documentation in front of you. You need to make whatever decision you want to make. Many of you know, I'll plant a little flag. I want to rewrite that policy because, as Sharon said, we want to change it to an engagement and divestment policy. What staff was not able to measure was whether or not ownership of these companies weakens the trust of a significant number of our members. We know it's immoral in many members' eyes, but you're a better judge than we, but absolutely. Everything is there for you to make a decision within your policy.
So Chris, on INV 184 of our divestment policy, it reads, quote, for potential for, quote, a material loss of revenue exists. I think it could be easily argued, well, I'm not going to argue what the material, and then it goes on to say, quote, where it weakens the trust of a significant portion of the members of the system. So we have 3 people in the queue. We'll hear from each one of them, and then, so we have Paul.
Thank you. So I want to get back to the question Harry asked at the beginning, which was the sort of the de minimis question of if we eliminated these companies from our portfolio, what impact would they have on being able to return 7% and being able to pay benefits? And both of our consultants said, well, there'd be no impact because they're so small. So what is the threshold for deciding that? And how and more specifically, how many of what's our broadest measure, the Russell 3000? How many of the Russell 3000 companies would fall into that category where you would give the same answer you gave with respect to these two companies? Anyone.
Having looked at these on different levels, it's kind of an art as well, depending on what index you're looking at. So when we're looking at oil and gas, if you look at, it's in Chinese oil and gas, and that's the index we're trying to follow, it makes an impact. But these are just in the broad Russell 3000, so it's not an impact, it's about 2 basis points.
I'm not asking what its impact on the index is. I'm asking what its impact on the entire portfolio is, which was the question that Harry asked. And I'm just saying the universe to answer my question should come from, of the Russell 3000. How many of those companies would our consultants give the same answer?
I'll jump in. 250.
250. Okay.
And the reason I come up with that, just so everybody understands the math behind that, it's not out of the sky totally. There are two methods to index management, not to be wonky. Replication, which is what we do. We try to own all 3,000. You've already divested of about, I think it's 28. So we own 3,000 minus 28 exactly and in the right order. There's also a method called sampling, where you own some subset that mathematically, as close as you can, like 0.98, 0.99 tracks that index. And that's where it's judgment call, but it could be, in the Russell 2000, you could drop probably 250 out of the 2,000, maybe even 300 or 400 out, and mathematically still be pretty darn tight to that index. And sampling is something we've actively discussed within the office. Is that more efficient than owning all 3,000? I know.
I'm not asking how many could we drop out. I'm asking company by company. Let's go through each one of those 3,000. Company number one. I asked the question that Harry asked. Is the answer immaterial or not? Then we go to number two. Not in aggregate, on an individual basis. How
I got you. Let me nuance my answer for you, Paul. It would depend. You could drop about 250, but you'd have to pay attention to their underlying industries because you would not. So a company could be extremely de minimis to the portfolio, but if it's the only company that's in a particular industry, and mathematically you want to make sure you have exposure, otherwise there's too much tracking error. And that's in essence what I understand. There's a legal question. I'm going to answer from an investment perspective. I would be worried therefore about tracking error, and that's where, even though it would be really small, I would say I still have to own it to be mathematically close to what you want to do. So I still would come back with roughly about 250, but it's not the smallest company up to number 249. It would be a slice out of those smaller companies that you could survive without. It's a hard answer.
Yeah, but I mean the concept that de minimis is an argument, and by the way, de minimis isn't even in our investment policy. Is that correct? That's correct. Okay. So we're making up policy on the fly if we use de minimis as our argument, because there's nothing in our policy that allows that. But if we were to approach it from that perspective, then what we could say is anybody who comes to us and says they don't like the business that one of those 250 companies is in, could come to us, and then we would have nothing but a non-financial argument. about whether or not to divest, right? And I think that's what we've been trying to avoid. We've been trying to avoid having non-investment, non-financial arguments, because God knows what these two companies are doing, and the pain and the suffering that goes on and their facilities is something I don't think anybody on this board doesn't think is really tragic. But we're trying to figure out how to function as fiduciaries, making sure that we get the returns that we need, and keep focused on that rather than turn this board into a discussion of this social issue or that social issue, which are really important social issues, but may not be what this board is about in our fiduciary duty, which is why I do wish we could hear from Harvey, because I don't think that Harvey really responded. But so first of all, I think we go down a real slippery slope, because if the de minimis thing is completely unrelated to our policy and unrelated to a financial consideration, and by the way, one de minimis plus another de minimis plus another de minimis at some point isn't de minimis. But the policy that we have says three things. It says that we have to meet three requirements, all three. It's not or, it's all three. And the first one is that there's been a sustained violation of one of our risk factors. So we can argue that with respect to this particular item, although staff and our consultants weren't able to identify, in their opinion, that there were violations. And number two, it has to lead to the expectation of material loss, which is a funny way to put it, because when you're talking about a small investment, the likelihood of material loss is smaller. So if we argue that these are de minimis, then it's hard to say that there's a material loss. And number three, and it has to undercut the trust of a significant portion of our membership. So I'm with the controller. I'm having a hard time figuring out how the policy as we have it written right now makes sense, and I think we've got a difficult time, as we always have had, trying to manage this issue with our fiduciary hat on, and that's again why I don't think that the Fiduciary Council's letter was asking for fiduciary advice on this issue. I think he made a comment, but I don't think it answers the questions that I would have to wanting to have Fiduciary Council advice before we make this decision. But absent that, I'm having a hard time figuring out how this meets our fiduciary obligation and our policy and avoids this becoming what we've clearly stated in our policy is where we don't want to go, is to be making decisions based on our social, political, moral judgments as a board. As individuals, yes, as individuals, we spend our time doing that, but not with our board hat on.
Karen?
Wow. Thanks again for the report. It was very, not concise, but there was over a lot of pages to read through, a lot of information that you provided to us. And it's an issue that's been bothering me since I joined the board, which was, over a year ago. And so it's been just the fact that we have to divest in something. And just lately, just because of all the things that we've seen on the news about the treatment of the population that's been affected by it. And it's really made me really think that there's a principle involved here. And I don't know if I'm going to be able to say this right, but my fiduciary responsibility is to the members. I'm one of the members that's really gaining the advantage of having the funds sent to my account every month. And so I really appreciate all the members that have come forward to say that this issue is something, or this fund is something that we have to divest from. So I'm kind of, that's one part of me. The other part of me says that the immoral part of it, that's one part. And then just the fact that there's a principle involved. There's a principle involved. And I will fight tooth and nail, I guess you can say, for principle. And it made me think about the other day, I substitute every now and then, and the other day I had to substitute for a 6th grade class, and we were talking about idioms. And throughout the day, I've been writing down idioms that people are saying. And one of them was, sitting on the fence. I feel like I've been sitting on the fence for the last few weeks, several weeks, and trying to figure out what the best thing for me to do. And, I've been reading all the letters that members have been sending. I've been seeing all the reports. I've read this report. I know that I have to make a decision because I do not want to not make a decision. But I have to make a decision that feels right for me. And I know that, what Paul says, our social issues, what's going to happen when another organization comes and says they don't like this or that. But for me, my decision is right now. I can't think about what other people are going to do in the future. And so, when I think about the decision that I have to make today to divest or not divest, I really didn't know how I was going to vote because I wanted to gather more information. And that's part of my job, I think, as being on the board, is to gather as much information as I can to make the best decision that I can based on the information that I have. And no one can fault me for that, because if it's the best information I have at the time, I'm going to do what I think is right. And so, I have to make a decision that I'm going to feel good about at the end of the day. So I think even though the fund is going to be affected in a small way, $1 million, $2 million is a lot of money. But for CalSTRS, it's not that much money, but to other organizations it is. To me, it is. And so to say that it's a de minimis effect on our fund, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter how much it is. It's the idea of the fact that we are in this fund, and we are in that. We have that. The company, basically. So I guess what I'm trying to say is that it will make me feel better if we divested, because in the end, I will know that I'm doing the right thing. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Yamamoto. I just want to be clear, because some of the assumptions that I've heard so far in the arguments has been to make a decision to exclude will have a negative impact on the return profile of the fund. That's not accurate, is that correct? Thank you. We don't know. To exclude these companies,
We don't know what the effect will
it
be
could have a
on our-
positive effect on the fund.
We don't know. I was asked
We
to do
just
it
don't know.
online. We don't know.
Okay, thank you. Dana?
Move to close debate.
Okay, it's been moved to close debate. Do we need a second for that? Is there a second? Oh, I'm sorry, then we will respect that. I got knocked off of line here.
okay.
So,
sorry. Yeah, I think we had a technical difficulty.
okay, so Dana, there wasn't a second yet to close debate. I would like to respect people that were in the queue before that have not spoken, okay?
I can get back in line.
So, Jacqueline, you have the floor.
Thanks. So because I think we're headed toward closing debate and kind of moving forward with the motion, I want to be clear about the parameters of and the reasons for this divestment. I think that it is imperative that the motion be clear and that the instructions to staff to implement be equally clear. So kind of specifically, and I'm not even sure if I'm asking this to staff, or I don't mean to put Nora on the spot, but whoever, as we have these and as we set out the motion itself, is the motion to divest from Geo Group and...
I'm sorry, Jacqueline, it's could you bring Buzz back in, please?
Okay.
Thanks.
So is the motion to divest from Geo Group and Core Civic specifically, is it specifically from those two companies, or is it from any company that engages in certain activities or business types? And if so, what are those? And I guess what I mean is the motion to divest from these companies because they operate private prisons or because they're housing ICE detainees, or both? Those are important distinctions to me. I know that the item that was written by staff, and it was such a great job, it was such a great, thorough report, addresses both of those, but the conversation has really been around detentions and around, detaining immigrants and asylum seekers. And to me, those things are really different. In the report, the staff also discussed the use of private prisons when capacity is needed in the prison system, in the public safety system. And we, the state of California, we've experienced such capacity issues. And we have employed, specifically in the Brown administration, a number of strategies for dealing with those capacity issues. But that has included the use of private prison beds, both in and out of state, to deal with those very real issues that we have. And so I would like some clarity as to whether the motion is to divest from companies that participate in the in the detention of asylum seekers. Are we saying this violates our principles and our ESG risk factors, or for our various reasons why we want to divest from that? Or are we saying, any company that operates or invests in a more traditional private prison? And I'm not trying to say that those are perfect or a great thing. Obviously, it's not our preferred way of dealing with capacity issues. But again, that distinction is important to me. And so I'd like to really understand, for the record, what this divestment movement is targeting, like why we're saying that this is the principle.
So Nora is the maker of the motion. The two companies that are named in the report, as you mentioned, Jacqueline, Core Civic and a Geo Group, which are specific to the detainee matter. So,
and that's a specific request that our members made, right, to divest from these two specific. I do want to clarify that when I came on the board about 2015, my first question was, how are we engaging? And I did that offline, and I asked to ensure that we were engaging, to ensure that was, because I understood that before divesting, we actually were doing that work. And we had those conversations at the beginning. So I think we're in a different situation now. And as a result, in my opinion, right, after reading the information and after seeing and hearing from our membership, I do think it impacts and there's validity in us divesting from these two specific prisons.
And I guess what I mean is sort of when the motion we're divesting from these groups, just from these two companies, period, or these two companies because this is the issue, sort of what the...
Right. Is it an issue or is it the companies?
Right. And is it that the companies are participating in ICE detention or that they run private prisons in general? That's the distinction to me, because I think that's a broader category of companies.
The issue we investigated, as Philip outlined, we looked at the broad issue of just detention in general. So we realized there were states, there were cities and counties and the federal government. The majority of our investigation on the risk factors dealt with immigration and immigration detention.